In this webinar, I am going to talk about some tools that can be used to think broadly about your site. The first tool I'm going to talk about is zones of use. This is a really useful way to start thinking about how you can use various parts of your land and how intensively they're managed. So this diagram here shows simple concentric circles, which will give you a sense of what the zones are. Our sites are never this simple, right? So the zones end up looking more like blobs that are spaced out around your property. But this diagram gives you a sense of once you start looking at your site through this lens, you can think more about relative location and placing elements in practical ways. So let's go through them, starting at the center, zone 00. The self and other relationships. We actually do a whole unit on this in the full PDC. We're not going to talk much about it here, but I do think it's important as we begin to embody the ethics and principles of permaculture that we not neglect to look at ourselves and the role that we may play in perpetuating violence against our environments, the ecosystem, and other humans. So this is the work of zone 00. Moving outward, that little pink ring there, zone 0 is our immediate household. So again, the same ideas apply with the relationships with people. Zone 0 also refers to the house structure itself. So what are your primary sources of energy in your home and how do these fit with the permaculture ethics? Are there ways that you can reduce the demand for energy that you're using for electricity, for example, refrigeration or clothes drying or entertainment? Are there ways that you can reduce demand for heating fuel? Can you add more insulation, get new windows, have an energy audit done? Can you think in terms of like heating zones for your house and blocking off certain rooms? There's a great handout that we have that invites structured and conscious thought around all of this that's in the shared folder. And I invite you to have a look at that. So orange here, we're talking now about zone 1. And this is the zone of most intensive use outside of your home. We expect to find things here that need continual observation and care multiple times a day, such as kitchen gardens, like herbs and salad greens, annual gardens that you want to check for pests. I have my little annual kitchen garden right out in front of my home so that I can check daily for the slugs who love to munch all of those little baby plants right now. Other things that you might put in zone 1, kitchen compost piles, maybe your tool shed. And so you place these things in areas that are like naturally well traveled, right? So in your natural zone 1s, and it really makes your life a lot easier rather than like trekking out to the far reaches of your property every day to water your lettuce, right? Why not put them in places where you are frequenting often? Moving outward, zone 2, this is where elements are placed that require attention maybe once a day or a couple times per week. Examples of things you might put in here are like perennial vegetables or bigger compost bins like for yard waste, maybe small livestock like maybe rabbits, semi-dwarf orchards perhaps, beehives, although maybe beehives might be out in zone 3 as well. Maybe you have a workshop that goes in zone 2. So we're moving outward, and we're as we move outward in these rings, we're getting to like the less intensively managed areas. But like I said, zone 2, you're still visiting there, maybe once a day or a couple times a week. Moving out to zone 3, this is sometimes called the farm zone. So you might manage it a few times a week to a couple times per month. Maybe larger standard fruit trees, staple crops, maybe pasture for larger animals like goats or horses, sheep, cows. Zone 4, this is the least managed of the zones, so it's often bordering on, quote, wilderness. And zone 4 encompasses woodlots, pasture, wildlife areas. It may be visited a few times a year for management. You can think of putting maybe low maintenance nut crops like chestnuts or acorns, oaks that you're gathering acorns from. There may be pastures here as well, but these are very minimally managed. Also in this little blue zone, you can see wild food gathering, wood cutting for fuel, and self-seeded trees. And then the final zone, zone 5, these natural unmanaged areas. We had considered these, and I quote here again, wilderness. I do think it's important to say that our concept of wilderness has changed as we've come to understand the land management practices of Indigenous people. If you think back to the 1491 article, landscapes that were previously thought to be wild were actually managed in a low intensity way that provided fuel or food for direct consumption, and also prime grounds for hunting. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there's a book called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson that I highly, highly recommend. It really changed my way of thinking about this subject. So this idea of zone 5 being wilderness, I call that into question, but however you choose to think about it, zone 5 really requires little, if any, maintenance, and is a place that you might go to forage, or just for observation or inspiration. Excuse me. So let's move on here. Not every site is going to encompass all of the zones, right? So maybe like a smaller, urban or suburban lot will have zones 1 through 3 or zone 0 through 3. When we're talking about designing land, we're mostly thinking about zones 1 through 5. I also want to note that zones do not have to be contiguous. You could have a zone 1 that abuts your house, and maybe it's right next to a zone 5. You could also have a zone 3 that is maybe right up against your door. I did a design for a home in South Portland a couple of years ago, and zone 3 was right outside their front door. They just didn't go there very often. And so the question then becomes, when you're designing, is do you work with that? Do you work with their natural patterns, noting those and designing accordingly? Or do you figure out why that area is not frequented? And in this case, it was a small lot. And the reason was that the family wanted more privacy from the road and the sidewalk. So it was actually this beautiful sunny spot. It just required some careful design thinking and sort of reorienting to get those folks to use that spot more. So here's another image of zones. And again, the zones don't necessarily have to look quite like this. I mean, you could have a zone 1 that maybe is a little bit of a further distance from your house, but it's still a place that for whatever reason you frequent multiple times per day. This just gives you a sense of how you can think about a piece of land, and it's a lens to look through, and hopefully a helpful tool. So if you have any questions about zones, jot them down. We can talk about them at the next in-person call. And the invitation for all of these tools is that you begin practicing them either on your own land or on a piece of land that you have access to. So moving on, the next tool I'm going to talk about is sector analysis. And with zones, we're looking at the areas within the bounds of our site. With sectors, we're looking at the forces that are outside of those boundaries. So it might be helpful to think of them as like energy flows through the site. It says here, influences from outside the site that can either be harvested, so they're either beneficial or mitigated, they're undesirable. Each of these flows has a directional component, and like I said, can either be beneficial or undesirable. This is sort of a mess of a map here, but this gives you a sense of some of the possible sectors that you might think about. Let's see, I think there's a better image on the next slide. Yeah, so basically you're thinking in terms of concentric, or you're thinking in terms of like a big circle around the boundary of your site, and then what are the forces of energy that are coming in from the outside. So for example, let's think about wind, right? What direction does the prevailing wind come from? Is it different for storm winds? Are there winds that are more inviting, like cool breezes in the summertime? And so thinking about the direction of those winds and mapping that out, we can then start to think about placing design elements to either mitigate or to allow for those nice cooler breezes. What about sunlight? What is the sun's pathway during the summer? How about the winter? Are there obstructions from the sun where you don't want them to be? Another one is wildlife, right? So do you have wildlife passing through your property? What paths are they taking? Does this change in the wintertime? And you can see how important observation becomes in all of this. So like noting wildlife tracks in snow or mud, or frequenting your sit spot regularly so you can really observe these patterns. All of this is super vital. There are also human energy forces, for example, neighbors, privacy, road noise, construction noise. So thinking about each of these elements and then mapping them in the circle as pictured can be incredibly useful when you start thinking about where you're placing the different elements. Here's another image. It might be a little bit blurry to see, but I liked the coloration in here. And again, you have this freeway noise. You have this privacy, desiring privacy sector. Here's your winter sun, your summer sun. So hopefully you can see how this might be used as a design tool as you start, again, thinking about the placement of different elements in your landscape. The next tool I'm going to talk about that can be really useful is an assets and challenges analysis. And this one is pretty straightforward. So when you think about your site, what are some of its assets and what are some of the challenges? There's a permaculture principle saying that the problem is the solution. So thinking about these assets and challenges can maybe give you a sense of the ways they might be turned around. This is a steep hillside in Australia that these folks really took the problem and turned it into a solution. And here is an example of an assets and challenges analysis that I did for a design for a person in Somerville. And he had a really beautiful site, lots of southern slope, 40 acres, and enormous aspirations. But he was all by himself. And so a big part of that design was getting him to recognize the challenge of just being one person, and how could he leverage different things to turn that into an asset, right? So this just like allows you to list off and like get a sense of the broader scope of your site. So finally, we come to the input-output analysis, or the functional analysis, as Bill Mollison calls it. And this is essentially, again, about relative location. All of these tools are really about relative location. So how do you place elements in relationship to one another, creating connection between them, right? So Bill Mollison says, it's not the water or a chicken or a tree, but it's how the water and the chicken and the tree are connected. And then he goes on to say that it's the opposite of what we're taught in school, right? That education takes everything and pulls it all apart and makes no connection. And so this core of permaculture is to make the connection because as soon as you have that connection, you can feed the chicken from the tree, right? Or you can water the chicken from the water source. They just have to be put in the right place to optimize that. So we set up the location so that the needs of one element are met by the yields of another. And that brings us to this input-output or functional analysis, which is a great tool for doing this. This is the famous permaculture chicken. Some of you all have probably seen this before. So we begin by listing the innate or intrinsic characteristics of the chicken, right? So the size, color, weight, heat and cold tolerances, their ability to rear young, and you note that different breeds will have different characteristics. So what breed are you looking to raise? Next, we look to the needs of the chicken, the basic needs. So for example, shelter, some kind of a dust bath, a roosting area, nest boxes if they'll be laying. They probably want some companions, they need food, they need some kind of grit for their crops. And then finally, we move on to the products and behaviors of the chicken, also known as the outputs. So the obvious ones, eggs or meat, feathers, manure, carbon dioxide, sound, heat, methane. We note that the chicken scratches for food when given the opportunity, right? That's a behavior. So the more we allow the chicken to adhere to its natural behaviors, the less work we have to do in providing for it. Mollison famously says that work and pollution are the result of incorrectly designed or unnatural systems. So we want to place the chicken in a way that its products can be used by other elements in the system. Otherwise, these elements or these products have the potential to become waste. And so we go through this input-output analysis with the chicken, and now we have ample information about the chicken and what its yields and behaviors and characteristics are. And then we think about the other elements that are in the design. There's a handout in the share folder that lists possible different elements you might want to include when you're designing a site. And so you decide which elements will be included or which elements you already have. And then you do this analysis for each of the elements, noting the overlaps. So for example, the garden needs fertilizer, mulch, water. The garden gives leaves, seeds, waste fuels. And so the chicken, think about these two things in relation, can provide manure, can absorb much of the garden waste. And so if they're placed in each other, this facilitates transfer of these materials. So what about the pasture or the orchard, right? The pasture needs weeding, needs manure, pest control. And so all functions can be aided by the chicken, right? When we look back at this function analysis. So how can we design to allow that to happen? I am pretty obsessed with mulberries right now after going to this guy Mo Martin's place at our PDC last summer during the height of mulberry season and gorging myself on them. And that mulberry tree that I so desperately want to plant tends to drop a lot of berries and make quite a mess. But what if I planted that tree over my chicken pen and then the chickens can clean up the mess? So hopefully you see what I'm getting at here. This functional analysis allows you to collect all of that information and then make the connection between the elements and let you place them in good relative location to each other. So again, the invitation is to practice all of these tools on your site. Take note of any questions that you have and please bring them to the next live Zoom discussion. You can also post questions on the Google Classroom, and I hope this was helpful.